If you walked down a street in an American city in 1905, you'd barely recognize what a street was for. Vendors selling food out of carts in the middle of the road, kids playing games between horse carriages, people strolling, chatting, crossing wherever they felt like crossing. The street belonged to everyone. Nobody planned to take that away. And yet, within about 50 years, most American cities had been quietly, methodically rebuilt around a single machine, and almost nobody alive today remembers that it happened on purpose. This isn't a story about a villain with a master plan, sitting in a boardroom deciding to make your commute miserable. It's stranger than that. It's a story about a series of individually reasonable-sounding decisions made by different people in different decades for different reasons that happened to compound into something none of them were specifically trying to build. And once you see the chain, you can't really unsee it in your own city. Beat. Here's the important part. None of this was one decision. It was a chain of smaller decisions, each one reasonable sounding on its own, each one building on the last, until the end result was something nobody had actually voted for. Cities where you basically can't survive without a car, where neighborhoods got sliced in half by highways, and where a walk to the corner store became something you'd need to drive to instead. Let's go through exactly how that happened. Beat. Step 1. Cars showed up and everyone hated them. In the early 1900s, cars were the intruders. When a car hit a pedestrian, and this happened constantly, newspapers blamed the driver. Public opinion was firmly on the side of the person walking. Cities considered laws capping how fast cars could go. Cincinnati even put a measure on the ballot to require speed governors on every car in the city. The automobile industry had, in modern terms, a genuinely serious image problem. In the 1920s alone, cars killed over 200,000 Americans, most of them in cities where cars and pedestrians were sharing the exact same space with no clear rules at all. So, the auto industry did something clever. Instead of making cars safer, they changed the argument about who the street belonged to. They funded safety councils that fed newspapers pre-written stories blaming careless walkers instead of dangerous drivers. They staged public shaming campaigns, clowns dressed as bumbling pedestrians, whistleblowing police herding people back onto sidewalks, and they popularized a brand new insult for anyone who dared walk in the street: jaywalker. Jay being 1920s slang for a hick, a rube, someone too dumb to know better. Within a few years, the entire framing had flipped. Streets, which had belonged to people for centuries, were being legally and culturally reassigned to cars. By the mid-1920s, cities across the country had passed jaywalking laws, and the argument was essentially settled before most people even noticed there had been an argument. Researchers who've traced newspaper archives from this exact period found something remarkable. You can watch the coverage flip almost overnight. Articles from 1923 still routinely blame drivers for pedestrian deaths. By late 1924, in the same cities, the same kinds of stories are blaming jaywalking instead. That's not a gradual cultural shift happening on its own. That's a lobbying campaign working exactly as designed, in real time, in the public record. Beat. Step 2. The law decided your neighborhood should only allow one kind of house. In 1926, a small Cleveland suburb called Euclid, Ohio, wanted to keep industrial development out of its residential streets, so it passed one of the country's first comprehensive zoning ordinances, carving the town into zones that dictated exactly what could be built where. A developer named Ambler Realty sued, arguing the rule destroyed the value of land it owned. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in Village of Euclid v. Ambler Realty, the court sided with the town. One justice compared apartment buildings to a pig in the parlor, the wrong thing in the wrong place, unfit for a proper residential neighborhood. That single ruling became the legal foundation for zoning across the entire United States. And it did far more than keep factories out of quiet streets. Cities used the same tool to draw enormous zones where nothing except large, detached, single-family houses were legally allowed to exist. No apartments, no duplexes, no corner shops, no small businesses within walking distance. It's worth being direct about why. This era of zoning grew directly out of earlier, openly race-based housing laws that courts had just struck down. When explicit racial zoning was ruled unconstitutional a decade earlier, cities pivoted to rules that achieved similar segregation through class and housing type instead, without ever mentioning race in the text of the law itself. The pattern caught on nationwide regardless of original intent in any specific city, because it let towns keep density, multifamily housing, and the people associated with both out, quietly, through paperwork, instead of through anything anyone had to say out loud. The practical result, decades later, is still visible on a map today. Enormous swaths of American cities where it is quite simply illegal to build anything except a single house on a single lot, which means illegal to build the small, walkable, mixed-use neighborhoods that used to be completely normal. Beat. Step 3. Highways went straight through the middle of everything. By the 1950s, the federal government had a new tool with enormous consequences. The Interstate Highway System, signed into law in 1956, promising to connect the entire country with high-speed roads. In theory, that meant connecting cities. In practice, engineers and city planners routed enormous elevated highways directly through the center of existing neighborhoods, because that's where the land was cheapest to acquire, and because the neighborhoods in the way were disproportionately poor and disproportionately black. City after city has the same story with a different name attached. In New York, urban planner Robert Moses drove the Cross Bronx Expressway straight through a dense, thriving neighborhood, displacing tens of thousands of residents and gutting a community that took generations to rebuild, if it ever fully did. Similar projects tore through black neighborhoods in Detroit, New Orleans, Miami, and dozens of other cities, places that had been walkable, tightly knit, full of small businesses, replaced by a wall of elevated concrete that cut the neighborhood in two and dropped property values on both sides for decades afterward. This wasn't hidden. Planning documents from the era are often disarmingly blunt about routing highways through what officials openly called blighted areas, which in practice meant the same neighborhoods that decades of restrictive zoning and discriminatory lending had already been starving of investment. The pattern compounds. First, zoning and lending practices decided which neighborhoods were allowed to thrive. Then, highway planners looked at the neighborhoods that had been starved of investment and called them the logical low-cost place to build. The scale of it is easy to understate. Nationwide, federally backed urban highway construction displaced well over 1 million people from their homes across the mid-20th century, concentrated overwhelmingly in neighborhoods that had little political power to resist a project already backed by federal funding. A community could lose its main commercial street, its churches, its schools, and the informal social fabric that took generations to build, all in the space of a single construction project lasting a few years. And the highway, once built, was permanent in a way none of the people living underneath its shadow ever got to vote on. Beat. Step 4. Parking ate the rest. Once cities committed to a car-centered layout, A quieter rule locked it in place almost everywhere else: the parking minimum. Starting in the mid-20th century, city after city passed laws requiring any new building, a restaurant, an apartment complex, a grocery store, to include a legally mandated number of parking spaces, calculated by formulas that had little grounding in actual research. Want to build a small 4-unit apartment building on a walkable street? The zoning code might require 8 parking spaces attached to it, whether or not the future tenants would even own cars. Want to open a small diner downtown? The code might require a parking lot bigger than the diner itself. The effect is almost invisible until you actually look for it. Enormous amounts of valuable urban land, sitting empty for most of the day, legally required to exist as asphalt instead of housing, shops, parks, or literally anything else. Cities that had once fit tightly packed walkable blocks were legally required to spread themselves out to make room for parking nobody was necessarily asking for, which made walking between buildings less pleasant, which made driving feel more necessary, which justified more parking. The system built its own excuse to keep expanding. Urban planners who've studied this call it a feedback loop, and it's a genuinely strange one to sit with. A city doesn't build parking because people already drive everywhere. People end up driving everywhere, partly because the city has already been rebuilt around parking. Once you spread buildings far enough apart to accommodate all those mandated spaces, walking between them stops being a pleasant 15-minute stroll and becomes a genuinely unreasonable 40-minute trek across empty asphalt, at which point, of course, you're getting back in the car. Beat. What it actually did to how people live. Stack all 4 of these on top of each other. Streets legally reassigned to cars, zoning that made compact neighborhoods illegal to build, highways that physically severed the neighborhoods that survived, and parking requirements that spread everything else even further apart. And you get the American city as most people alive today have only ever known it. A place where walking somewhere useful without a car is often not just inconvenient, but genuinely impossible. By design, on purpose, according to the actual text of the law. None of the individual people making these decisions were trying to build the version of American life we ended up with. Commutes eating hours a day, corner stores replaced by strip malls a 20-minute drive away, kids who can't walk to a friend's house